The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
This is a reading of the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus and his disciples, on their way to Jerusalem, came to Jericho next. And as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a sizable crowd, there was a blind beggar named Bartimaeus sitting by the roadside. On hearing that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to call out, "Jesus, Son of David, have pity on me." Many people were scolding him to make him keep quiet, but he only shouted the louder, "Son of David, have pity on me." And then Jesus stopped and said, "Call him over." So they called him over, and telling him as they did so, "You have nothing to fear from Jesus. Get up, he's calling you." Bartimaeus threw aside his cloak, jumped up, came to Jesus. Jesus asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And Bartimaeus said, "Rabboni, I want to see." And Jesus said in reply, "Be on your way. Your faith has healed you." Immediately, he received his sight and started to follow Jesus up the road to Jerusalem. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Thank you. The second reading today stops short of three very important verses in the 5th chapter of the book of Hebrews. And you will hear them now. In the days when Jesus was in the flesh, he offered prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to God, who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Son though he was, Jesus learned obedience from what he suffered. And when perfected, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, designated by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Son though he was, Jesus learned obedience from what he suffered. Nowhere else in the entire New Testament will you find that revelation. Nowhere. The closest you will see it in a live narrative is the agony in the garden, recorded by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's the closest we see Jesus learning obedience from what he suffered. I would like to break this down into 3 words, okay? Learning, obedience, and suffering. Okay. We have to start with learning because that's where all human beings start, and that's what we do our entire life. From the womb, we are learning. As we see infants and children learning constantly, learning, processing new experiences, and learning about everything. I mean, it's like a human being is born into a world in which they know nothing, and they have to learn everything, to start it from scratch. And build, that learning has to build and build and build and build. And it's all experiential, okay? It's not an app that you can just buy it and plug it in and it's there. No, we have to learn by experience, amen? Like falling off of a dock. You learn by experience. Watch your feet. Keep them on the dock, or they'll go into the water, and the rest of you will follow. And if you grab anything, it's going to tear your arm off. That sort of deal. It didn't tear it off. It was just a tendon. So our learning is that's inherent to being a human being. So if we say that our belief is Jesus was true God and true man, then we have to say that Jesus learned. Jesus learned as a human being his entire life. Okay? And when you think about his parents, you had the Blessed Mother and St. Joseph. I mean, what a great place to learn. What a great place to start out. You're learning. Okay? Get you off on the right foot. Then there's obedience. Okay? Now, I don't know about you, but when I first learned about the big O, obedience, okay, I learned it as something, this is what you do what you're told, and to not do what you're told not to do. So here's the to-dos, and here's the not-to-dos. And if you don't obey those rules, bad consequences are coming for sure as sunrise. Amen? That's how you learned obedience. You learn behavioral consequences. And it was ingrained in your memory and in your backside and in all kinds of places. That you learned obedience behaviorally, okay? That is one level of obedience, okay? There's a whole other level of obedience that has to do not with conformity of behavior, but with conformity and communion of will, of conscience, of judgments, of choices, of purpose. That's a whole nother level of obedience. And we know what that is, okay? 6.5 years ago, I was sent up here to you out of obedience to the then bishop, okay? Now, if my obedience had stopped with that, the 6.5 years of my being here would be a total waste of my time and yours. Amen? If I had stopped learning obedience with that, it would have been a total waste. Okay? But I didn't do that. And you didn't do that either. We took this as the opportunity to learn and to grow in things that we didn't know we needed to learn and grow that way. Amen? Weren't there some surprises in this whole thing? Amen? Were for me, I can tell you that. All kinds of surprises. Like, what am I doing here? Well, here's what you're doing here. Let's let God explain to me a day at a time, an experience at a time, an opportunity at a time. That's learning obedience to God. It's to learn, what purpose does God have for this? You know? God takes things, decisions, and whatever that are human choices, and then God molds those opportunities for God's own purpose. It's kind of like my winding up at the VA. I thought it was over house payments. God had a much bigger purpose than that. God was going to convert Bob Rost over a grudge he had been holding on for 40-some years. And he needed to outgrow that and let it go. And he needed to learn from these Vietnam veterans and their families what kind of pastoral care they needed. They are my teachers. I needed to be taught. I needed to learn, and I needed to obey. And then they're suffering. Then they're suffering. The hardest teacher. The hardest. And I am by far not the expert on that. Learning obedience through suffering. So I look to those who are the experts. And that's very important for us to be able to do with Jesus. Amen? Because when we're in our suffering, we need to go to somebody who knows what that's about. We need to go to somebody who is not afraid of that. We need to go to somebody who is not absent or distant from that. We need to go to somebody who's right there with us, knowing us from the inside out. Jesus doesn't have to guess what we're feeling, what we're going through. He doesn't have to guess at all. He knows. He knows more than we do. We just know at the moment. Jesus knows the whole experience. And only Jesus knows where that redemption and how that redemption and when that redemption is going to happen. In this life and in the next. As it was for him. In this life and in the next. And he even made that transition. He rose from the dead and he came back. He didn't just rise from the dead and sail on up to heaven into his throne and say, bye. He came back to make sure we would know that there's a whole transition going from this life into the next life. And then those gates which were closed are now open. And they're open for all. They're not just open for the chosen few. Because he died for all. Okay. He took the title teacher. That was a self-designation that Jesus gave. And so that's what the disciples always called him, teacher. And it was that, and they always called him that because they knew that they needed to learn from him. And he could teach them lessons nobody else could teach. And the lessons don't get any bigger or deeper or more important than the lessons that we learn in suffering. And Jesus is the one that teaches. So, whatever of that we have, this morning, let's bring that to him, knowing he's already waiting for us. He's already ready for us. He already knows what we need before we ask.